This is The Right Approach. I'm J.W. Judge, and with me is my co-host Barbara Hensky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is D.R. Ransdell, who is the author of the Andy Veracruz Mysteries series. She has also been trying her hand at writing screenplays. So she's here today to talk with us about applying the lessons learned from screenwriting to writing our novels. So DR, welcome to The Right Approach.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Yeah, and I did not plan this. This is like this third episode in a row where I've said, I didn't plan this, but this ties in really well to the previous episode because last week we talked with Dr. Millie Eidson about why she enjoys shifting between writing novels and short stories, and the experimenting that she can do with short stories that writing novels doesn't necessarily lend itself to. But you're making an even more drastic jump when you go between writing novels and screenwriting. And so let's start with your fiction writing background. Just tell us how you got into writing fiction and where that starts with you.
I've been writing my whole life, actually. I remember, it's funny you talk about third grade, going back that far. I remember coming home and I was like, I'm going to be a writer. And I sat down and I wrote a short story about Samantha the Martian, and she came down and taught school for the day. And so that was the start, and then, yeah, I wrote throughout high school, took some writing classes in college, but there's always that thing about the day job, so and I've done a lot of work with foreign languages. Anyway, I got a degree to teach Spanish. I lived in Mexico for a while, and that's where I drafted my first novel, which is still in my closet, which is where it should belong. I had a couple of those novels in the closet where they belong. And then it wasn't until I was in graduate school that I wrote Amorosian Nights, and that was the first book that actually got published. So, and that was to balance graduate work, which wasn't always fun. And then it was the mysteries, So I lived in Mexico. I really loved being there. And what happened is that I played in an orchestra, and my stand partner was in a mariachi. And he always said, "Oh, está fácil, it's easy." And when I got to Tucson, when I moved back to the States, I came here to Tucson, and I worked my way into a mariachi. And it wasn't easy at all, but it was really, really fun. And I loved being with the mariachi and being with the gang. And it was after I'd been in the mariachi for a few years that I got the idea for this protagonist. I wanted to write a mystery. And in mariachi, you don't read music unless you're doing like kind of a special presentation of some kind. So when you're playing Guantanamera for the 9 millionth time that week, trust me, you're not listening to it or paying attention to it. So you start watching the people you're playing for. And that's how I got a great idea of, let's have a protagonist who's a mariachi player, and he gets bored. So he's watching things, and then he sees, bad things that go on, because that's what happens. People do really funny, interesting, bad things that are fun to observe. So that was sort of a long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I got started.
No, I think that's great.
You get high marks for the most original way, as from playing in a mariachi band. Okay, good for you.
Well, it's incredible how much you notice about other things that are going on. And so we played in a restaurant. It was called El Mariachi down here in Tucson, but it went out of business. But anyway, you've got time, other people are taking care of the lead part of the song. And, you notice, oh, he didn't come in with her last time, and, stuff like that. So yeah, it can get really interesting. Yeah.
It sounds like I need to do more people watching. That's not something I do very much of, but it sounds like it lends itself to a lot of creative insights.
Well, another funny thing that happened is that I don't look Mexican. I'm not. I'm a quarter Italian. So people would say things behind my back. We would go out into the audience, the violin players, and people would say things like, ¿Qué está haciendo aquí? What is she doing here? And then I would turn around and then ask them in pretty good Spanish what song they wanted to hear. And then they would just be like, ah. So it's always fun to catch people off guard.
All right. So you've been writing novels. What caused you before we get into some of the specifics about it, what caused you to decide to try your hand at screenwriting?
I tried that a couple times along the way, maybe 15 or so years ago, maybe 20, but I was stubborn and poor at that time. So I was just doing like there's a very certain format for it. And I was doing it with Word, which you can do if you tab around to the right, things, but it's really awkward. And then I don't know, it's sort of like just a wild hair thing. And it was COVID. It was the beginning of COVID. It was the spring of 2020. I sat down. The first thing I did in COVID was sit down and start writing a novel, which I just sat down and wrote straight through until I was done. And then somewhere along that time, I'd had an idea in the back of my head about an idea that would be fun to write out as a screenplay. And, by now, okay, I've been working full time, so I could afford to buy Final Draft without it, being a big problem for my budget. And I just started. I just sat down and started one day. That's how crazy it was. I didn't even have any coherent ideas about the story. I had this idea for a vampire in Venice and how fun that would be. I loved to go to Venice. So anyway, I just started. And of course, I started doing, most of the wrong things the wrong way, as you do. I got a couple of, books that were helpful, including the Screenwriter's Bible, which is sort of the Trottier. It's one of the big standards in the field of screenwriting. And so I sort of stumbled along for a while. But, looking back on it, I think another thing that was going on was that, honestly, I was very, very alone during COVID, during that spring. There were about 10 people. I think there were, yeah, plus me. So like 9 people I was in touch with and that I saw on a regular basis. I think I needed somebody to talk to. So, well, having people on the page, having dialogues even more than you do in fiction, I think it was a way to have somebody that I was talking to. That might sound kind of weird, but in retrospect, I think that might have been going on. It's just a very strange period of time. I had more time to write, which was good, and I did use it. I used it productively, but I didn't have many people to talk to during the day. And I'm the kind of person that, I've been single for a long time, but I usually talk to somebody in person every day before COVID. So I needed those characters to come alive, I think.
So how did you go about, well, let's start with this. So for folks who haven't looked at a screenplay or treatment before, just from like the basic elements, what is significantly different in writing a screenplay versus, sitting down, writing paragraphs in a novel and that sort of thing?
Let me talk about how it looks. A page for in a script is supposed to have a lot of white space, right? So in other words, you look at a novel, even if the chapter starts halfway down the page and you get some white space at the top, then you get dense, usually, even if there's dialogue, you get denser stuff at the bottom. And in a screenplay, it's mostly dialogue, but it's broken up by these pieces of action. So even the way it looks is different. That's what you're supposed to have, so that, usually, unless you're famous, so you'll go through a script reader, somebody will read your script, and they're going to be looking very, very quickly at the first about 10 pages, and they're going to be looking for the action. They're going to want to flip those pages really quickly, and they're going to want to be able to scan, find the dialogue, find little bits of action, and go right on. So that's not something that I noticed so much when I was writing, but as I've continued to work with different screenplays, that's what I've noticed a lot. I thought, silly me, I thought, oh, well, I'm good at writing dialogue. In fact, I think that's what I do best in the novel writing. So I thought, oh, screenwriting, why would that be hard? It should be easy for me. But instead, there are techniques for how you have to do that writing, because you don't have much space for it. Most screenplays, especially if you're, novice, if you're not hired to write something, you've got about 100 pages, usually between 90 and maybe 105. So you have to be very aware of how much space you have and how much time you have. So you have to learn to be very economical, which is something I haven't done. Like the last novel I wrote, I think was 90,000 words, but you don't have that kind of leeway in a screenplay, usually.
So how did you make that transition? Were there sources or groups or that helped you? Because there are a lot of tips and tricks. So
Right.
and how did you learn them?
Still learning. So like I mentioned, the Screenwriter's Bible, this Trottier book, that was really helpful. But then I came across, I don't know, I stumbled across, it was still COVID, I think. So it was, partly because of that. There's a website called writeyourscreenplay.com. And Jacob Kruger gives classes on screenwriting. So that's actually the first officials. I had gone, like in a couple of mystery conferences, I'd gone to a session or two on screenwriting, but I really hadn't done anything specific. And then I took this thing with Jacob Kruger. The name of the class was, I don't know, Screenwriting 101 or something like that. But the website is writeyourscreenplay.com. That was really helpful to me. He took us through some very specific things to do, but he also, he runs through his website, he runs some groups that writing groups for screenplays, and you pay for it. It's not for free, but I joined one of those, and that's really where I started having to hone in. So the group I'm in, we meet every 2 weeks, and we take turns reading pieces of our screenplays, talk about them, talk about what works, what doesn't work, and that's really where I've become very sensitive to how much of a transition I have to make. So the ironic thing is that, you start thinking with a different part of your brain. Oh, the novel works this way, the screenplay works this way, and sometimes those things converge. It's so interesting. I was listening the other night to, you have a nice interview with Dogoni, and he was saying that I think you guys asked him, well, do you, what about screenwriting or something? And he said he's been asked to do scripts, but that he sticks to what he's good at. And that makes a lot of sense. I can really see that point of view, but I can't do that. I'm really terrible at sticking to one thing. So I just really had to, I don't know, give it a try. Thinking that way, though, helps you think backwards and forwards and sideways somehow.
Well, and you're putting in the effort to learn it and do it right. I've got a number of author buddies who think they can just take their book and throw it into some screenwriting software and turn it into a screenplay, and that does not work for the reasons you said. What is maybe one of the most surprising tips or tricks that you learned about writing a screenplay?
I think probably even as a fiction writer, writing description is not that easy for me.
Yeah.
But in screenwriting, you have to do it in a very, very, very specific way. So whereas, you might have a sentence, in your fiction where, she walked around the room arranging, the silverware and took out a knife or something like that. But in screenwriting, you have to break it down piece by piece by piece. So she walks around the table. Oh, but wait, walks is too boring of a verb. She circles the table. She arranges the placemat. She takes the silverware from the cupboard. So it's very specific. You have to do it in those little bites. You don't do it in full sentences. You don't like repeat the name. You don't have to keep putting that in. So you take those kind of shortcuts. But the idea is that, or what they've keep telling me in workshop, you have to do it piece by piece by piece. Okay, in turn, what's really good is that this has made me have to stop and think when I'm writing fiction too, piece by piece. I have to stop and see it. I think before I would just sort of, I do draft quickly and then go back and fix things. But when you have to stop and consider every movement, every moment of motion, you have to stop and think how to describe that so that people can get it. Okay, right now I'm not in a fiction writing workshop, but in this screenwriters workshop, they'll tell me, well, what do you mean? She swiveled around. Was she trying to kill him? Oh, no. Okay, so she turned 180 degrees. She drew the gun. You have to just break everything down into these little bitty pieces.
I think
you have to think. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's really interesting, and I hadn't considered it before. That's because your intended audience is different. Like you are delivering a set of instructions in your screenplay, right? And that the reader is then going to interpret those instruction and apply them, and those become their actions. Whereas with the novel, your reader is the ultimate intended audience as opposed to a viewer, down the line, or someone who's going to act this out. And so, what you are trying to accomplish with that text is such a very different thing from giving instructions to a person as opposed to describing the situation, and making sure that they can visualize and hear and smell, and like all their senses come into play when you're writing the novel, and they need to be fully immersed into it. Whereas the actor who's going to do these things in the screenplay, they need to have a specific set of instructions, and they can take it from there, to bring it to life. Does that make sense?
Right. It's sort of two-part, because first you got to get through whoever's reading the script, right? They have to be able to understand what you're doing immediately. They don't want fancy prose. They don't want long sentences. They have to. One piece of advice I got along the way for the screenwriting thing is that write it so that a caveman can understand it. Okay, that doesn't mean really that it's not interesting. It means that it has to be really graspable from the go, so you don't have any time to get to. Right now I'm reading a Thomas Cook book. He's great. Falling Leaves, he's great. A lot of description, beautiful sentences. You don't have time for that. You have to get straight to it, get right in. That reader has to be able to immediately understand what the action is, because you've got to be able to visualize it. And you're right, then the actor has to be able to visualize it too. You can handle some of that in something called production notes, but when you're writing, you don't worry about that. You just have to make it as clear as it can be so that they don't misinterpret. I've had that happen a lot when people have been reading, my drafts. Are like, yeah, but we don't understand. How did they get there? Or how did they get, it has to be really clear.
So
And it sounds like you don't want to let the actors interpret from the dialogue what the emotion is supposed to be. You're in your directions, you're going to tell them they're upset, they're sorrowful, they're tearful, they're afraid. Don't leave it up to interpretation.
Right. And in fact, you can't say he's sad. You have to say, I don't know, he turned away, his shoulders drooped, his knees bent, he fell off the chair. So yeah, you don't have a way to use he's tired, he's angry. You have to show it instead. It's easy to show somebody's angry. Some of the other emotions are more difficult, or they're happy. So I have this character I'm writing about right now, Julina, and she's Brazilian. So instead of walking around the room, maybe she sambas around the room, or she whistles. As so you've got to think of all these creative ways to get people from one part of the room to the other part of the room, and that's been a challenge too. It's not something I've thought about. Now I do. Now I look at any piece of fiction and it's like, oh, no walking, no sitting, no talking.
So you've talked about how with screenwriting, you really have to get right into it. You have a very small window to catch that reader's opportunity to decide whether they want to pass it along or be done with it. Yeah. And I think that's increasingly true when we're writing novels, that, especially with Kindle Unlimited or other subscription services, library books, where there is no cost of entry for the reader. They haven't paid outright for the book. So if they decide early on that they're out, they haven't lost anything other than a few minutes. So you have a very short window of time to capture their attention in those opening pages. They might not give you more than a chapter to do that. So how have you taken what you've learned in doing that in screenwriting and applied it to writing novels of catching attention early?
Well, I've especially tried to look at the beginning of a chapter, and not get too wound up with the description, try to get to that quicker. Another thing that I'm more aware of now is just even the dialogue has to be really concise. You guys had an interesting interview. It was the other day with a gal, Gilbert, and she was saying something about dialogue, and she was saying something about doing a workshop with Don Moss. I've done several workshops with him. They've been really, really helpful. And one of the things he talked about was that, like in dialogue, he feels like a lot of times he's reading a fiction book, and he notices this dialogue as if the writer never went back and edited it. Okay, I thought I was good at writing dialogue, right? So I get, these scenes and stuff, and the people in the workshop were like, hey, you kind of already said that. Just say it once, get out of there, shorten that line. So that's something I've really had to think about too. And indeed, right now I'm, looking at a draft of a novel, and I'll go back when I'm drafting. I don't worry about it. I just, write right through, and then, go back. And wow, you can really tighten and shorten a dialogue, even if what you're doing is tightening the line. If you do that often enough, boy, do you change how something reads. Now, I've been noticing, like the trend, like especially in thrillers, like look at Dan Brown. One of the things I don't like about thrillers are like the one sentence paragraph and things like that. I don't think that's stylistic enough, but you're right, Jeremy. You have to hurry up and get into enough action that people don't put your novel or whatever piece of writing is down before they kind of get hooked into what you're trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I'm querying my fifth novel, and Barb and I have talked about this a bit, and I am on my second round now. And in the first round, I got feedback from an agent that said, "Hey, I thought this was interesting, but I felt like in this first chapter that your protagonist was too much of an observer." And at first, I was like, "Well, you just need to read, chapters 2 and 3, and they're not an observer anymore." And I was talking about it with somebody, and they said, "Well, you might not get a reader might not give you 2 and 3, so like they're not wrong. They're going to get the same impression as that reader's going to get." So I tried to figure out what to do with that, and so I changed them to make them more active in that. Then I also decided, I tell you what, I'm just going to take chapters 4 and 5 where there's a whole bunch of action and it involves the protagonist, and I'm going to throw them at the beginning. And then after those first 2 chapters, we can step back and say, okay, now that you're in the thick of things, let's take a breath, go back and see the setup and go from there. And so, I can really identify with what you're saying there, because I had very much that experience with somebody who gave me that feedback and made me had to think about it and figure out what to do going forward.
Yeah, that can be a useful trick, to switch chapters and put a more active chapter. You don't have time. And I think, it just is, I think things are going to get worse rather than better. I think people have less patience now than they even did before with reading. And, I teach writing at University of Arizona. And I used to ask people what they like to read, but now I don't ask them anymore, because it's too depressing when they say, I never read. And what they do read are just little things, like on social media or stuff like that. People are so used to reading just little bitty things that are short that it's harder and harder, I think, for them to get into a whole paragraph. And who knows, maybe after you take another look at your draft, you might think, well, maybe I could shorten some of this observation, and that might be useful. In a screenplay, here's how it starts. The beginning, like on a regular screenplay, the beginning is just like exterior. Valenzuela house, Orange County, day. And then you don't even start with, this was a mistake I was making at the beginning. I'd say, something about the kitchen or what it looked like or whatever. No, you have to start with Julina, 50, waltzes around the kitchen. Oh, wait, kitchen would be in the title. Oh, you take that out. Julina waltzes around the table, whatever. You just have to start with that action. That's what everybody expects, and you have to start with that. So it's hard. Sometimes it seems like very hard to get things in, and you look for ways to make shortcuts, like no repeated words, stuff like that. What my Linda Roberts gal I've been working with, and she says, If you've got a kitchen, you don't have to tell us there's a table there. We'll assume there's a table there. If you say dining room, we're going to assume there's a table. Same thing for other parts of the house. So you make some assumptions. You also can't have things come out of thin air, but you just try to take make use of every single shortcut. A lot of times I've gotten through the end of the script and it's like, oh, like 5 pages over what it should be. So then I have to go back and even just tighten things so they fit on 1 line instead of 2 lines. Same thing with dialogue. You know, the way dialogue is written, it comes in on both sides. So you'll have maybe, I don't know, maybe 7 words on a line of dialogue before it goes to the next line. So there's a lot of ways to shorten dialogue, which I never noticed until I was really trying to do it.
So tell us about some of those. Give an example, if you would. Ways to shorten dialogue.
Well, one thing is, I think I'm going to kill him. Okay, that I'm going to, I think I'll kill him. So even something as small as that can help you out over the long run because you do it enough times that it makes a difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm always trying to think what are some little things I can skip, and also not saying things more than once. Gosh darn it, when I'm drafting, I tend to do that several times. I'll write, you know, I don't know, I'll just find that some things are repetitive and you just have to get rid of all of that. So that I'm going to, you know, if you would go through your maybe not yours, but me, when I'm going through my novel, I know, because all the screenwriting is like in present tense. She picks up the gun, she turns around. So in a novel, it might be I turn, but I've noticed that in fiction, I'll have passages where she was going to whatever it was. No, she went, she saw, not she was going, she was seeing, she was observing, whatever. Take out you know, I know you're supposed to get rid of, you know, to be verbs anyway, but I noticed that I do that a lot in writing. And so if you take all those things out over time, oh my goodness, you know, just think about if on a single page of prose, if you have 10 examples of that, doesn't seem like a lot, but Peter Elbow would say every time you take out a word, you're saving the reader a little bitty bit of energy, and that's cumulative. So it's really important to try to do that.
So one thing I was curious about is with having well, now my brain's dropping out here. Such a smaller number of words to work with, and trying to establish your characters and their uniqueness, but you don't have the exposition or the narrative to be able to do that. How do you develop your characters into, you know, real people that have depth with that different format of screenwriting, and has that translated in any way to changes you've made with writing novels?
I would say that doesn't seem as hard for me, but I think it's because of the dialogue. So, so for example, I'm writing a character right now who's Brazilian. So, and she's very jealous. So she might say something like her daughter's like, oh, you know, should I come to the party tonight? You know, come. You know, even with a 3-word sentence, just with a very minimal amount of dialogue, you can convey what somebody is like. So to me, that doesn't seem like as hard of a thing. What I've had to do more is learn how to amp something up. Okay, I get this in the workshop all the time. Amp it up, amp it up, amp it up, amp it up. So, for example, I was writing this one scene. I had this scene where this crazy lady, Julina. But anyway, so she hides the gun in her purse, and my workshop people were like, "Hey, hiding a gun in a purse, you should have more fun with that." So then I had to look back at the scene there in the living room, and I had to think, okay, where are all the places she could try to hide it? All right, so she could try to hide it under the music stand, and the stand falls over, and tries to hide it in the piano bench, and she can't close the piano bench lid, and finally she throws it into the piano, and then it pings. But I had to stop and go back and really think, what are the things that I can do to make this more visual and more fun? That's something that I just don't think I've done enough in my own fiction. And so, you know, having to do it in this other way having to think every time, how can you make this scene stand out more, has helped me really think through what I have to do. The dialogue isn't as hard. Getting the character across, you can do that with a few lines of dialogue, but stopping long enough to see things and to think every single time, how can I make this bigger? Has to be bigger, has to be, I'm writing comedy, has to be bigger, more fun, more action, more reactions from the other people, more. That's what they always tell you. And yeah, even Don Maas, and in his workshops, he'll say, go for more. Maybe somebody will say, stop, that's too much. Oh, wait, no, that's never what happens. It's the same thing usually in screenwriting. I suppose I could write a scene that's so over the top that somebody would say, why don't you tone that down a little bit? That's not very likely. And you can imagine too, it's easy to tone something down. It's hard to build something up. So for me, it's that building it up, amping it up, more, thinking visually all the time. I'm not used to that. You don't have the smells, you can't, that's not, well, if there's a cooking scene, that might be in there, but you don't use that as much as just the visuals. And then of course the auditory. So, you'll have things banging or popping or snapping or something like that. But you've really got to think about it visually, because in people are watching a movie. What are they, what are they doing? They're watching. You've got to be able to make that alive for them.
Switching tracks a little bit, to talk about, I guess, the business side with novel writing and getting your books into the world. When you publish independently, there aren't any gatekeepers. It's a matter of you writing the book, creating the book, putting it through all the processes and putting it into the world. But with writing screenplays, to have that realized into something more than a screenplay for people to see, there are only gatekeepers. And so how has that, affected you and your process and what you do going about your business there?
Yep. Yeah, you're right. There are a lot of gatekeepers. So what I've done the most is, well, what I started doing really was entering contests, because that's a good way to get noticed, but it's hard to get through because, a lot of gatekeepers. So, so far I've only I've gotten to quarterfinals and a couple of things, but that process is really hard. A lot of people produce their own stuff and try to film it, but oh boy, that's a whole new ocean of fish that I don't think I'm at this moment right up to doing. There's also ways that you can, but you pay for it. It's even, you think novel writing is competitive. Wow, screenwriting is even more competitive because, I know you have friends, everybody thinks they can write a novel, but let me tell you, everybody and their grandmother, their uncle, and their cousin think they can write a screenplay and that it's going to be easy. So it's an even bigger pool of people who are doing things. A lot of what they're doing isn't very good, I think, but they're still doing it. So you're still competing with it. So you can pay to do pitches. There's a thing called Virtual Pitch Fest. So I've gotten a little bit of attention doing that, but I need to be more aggressive well, I was, in the process of sharpening up some scripts, so I'm going to try that again. But that's another way to get through. You can even go to conferences that are based around pitching. I'm not a real good pitcher. It's hard for me to be like, oh, my screenplay is, this and this, the elevator pitch. But you have to learn to be a little bit more aggressive in that. So that's the next round of things that I have to learn how to do better. So there you go. Right now, there are a lot of contests, and some of them are worthwhile and some of them aren't as worthwhile. You have to do a little bit of research. Well, you can do that. Ask Google, what are the 10 top screenwriting contests? But what's kind of interesting, but a little bit confusing, is that they all have different dates when they open and close. So when they open, it's one price, and then you might be able to, say Blue Cat right now. It's Blue Cat is about 10 days until the early bird entry. So that's one price. You could enter your thing later, like maybe a month later, it's going to be another price. So you have to keep on top of when to enter what, unless you want to pay a lot more to enter your script. So that's another thing. The radar is constant. You have to have your radar constantly checking for all of these different things. And there's different contests all year round, but they have their own rhythms and stuff. And some of them are real expensive, and you don't want to have to wait until the last minute to enter them.
As we get ready to close this out, I want to say that what I've really enjoyed and appreciated about this conversation is the continual evolution that you have shown and continual willingness and effort to learn and try new things. And I just think that says a lot about you and just this constant endeavor to do more and do different and try out new things. I think that is something that we can all strive to achieve. So before we go, please tell folks where to find you, follow you if you're active on social media, and to get your books.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'd love to do that. So my website is dr-ransdell, RANSDELL.com. Yeah, I'm on Facebook under my full name, which is Diane Renee Ransdell. So those are the two quickest places to find me. Yeah, my books are on Amazon. That's the easiest place to find them. The Andy Veracruz series is the longest one, 5 books. And then as I said, I'm a quarter Italian. My latest book just put out is called Party Wine. It's actually a finalist for a Silver Falcon at the Killer Nashville conference,
Great.
which is like next week. So that's pretty exciting. So yeah, those are the best places to find me. And yeah, my great aunt used to say, if you're not learning something every day, you might as well be 6 feet under. So I do try to keep learning stuff, and it's surprising how much you can learn. I'm a Gemini, and I think that too has to do with the shifting back and forth between different things. I seem to learn better when I have some way to shift. I don't know, maybe I'm just crazy, but there you go.
Well, we will all try to stay on the right side of the ground and keep on learning. And thank you so much for your time being with us today.
Yeah, this has been great and
Thank you
inspirational.
so much.
Yeah, thank you.